So, hello everyone, and welcome to another vlog by the Butterfly Princess Send Initiative, Steph. I'm here today joined by Heidi Steele. This is episode 2 of a series about unschooling, and today we're going to talk about how we can support SEND children. So SEND means special educational needs and or disabilities, how we can support them children outside of the schooling system. And we're also going to be talking about sensoritizing. Heidi's going to be sharing a few of her own experiences with us today, because she has children with SEND, but she also unschools them children, so they don't go to school. They're like homeschooled in a way, because Heidi doesn't agree how in like the schooling system. So I'll pass you on to Heidi now to explain how we can really support SEND children.
Hi Steph, it's nice to be here again.
Thank you for joining me.
All right, I'm going to introduce myself briefly again for people that haven't seen the first vlog that we did, although I would really encourage people to go and listen to that one as well. My name is Heidi Steele. I am a former teacher and a home educating parent. Specifically, I unschool my own children, which if you want to know more about that, well, carry on listening now, but we covered a lot of that in our first vlog. And I have 4 always unschooled children who are currently aged 14, 12, 9 and 7. And they are happy living and learning as they go. So I've been doing this, or we as a family have been doing this for over 10 years. And as I said, my children have never been to school, so they have never had sort of a schooled experience. I write regularly at liveplaylearn.org, and I do podcasts and sort of YouTube vlogs myself. And we're about to be interrupted. Hello. Yes, I do various things. I do webinars and things. So if you're interested in any of that, you can find out about those at my Facebook page, which is Live, Play, Learn. And I also provide sort of daily encouragement and support in that space as well. So that's where you can find me. It wasn't really my intention when we started home educating that, what's the word I'm looking for, that I would have a particular focus on sort of special educational needs, maybe. It has always been my focus to support my children, no matter what they chose to do or how they chose to do it. So we use the word facilitated a lot. I facilitate a lot of what they want to do. It transpired that we discovered, I guess, through the many years of just over the years, when we set out to home educate, I didn't know that my children would have special educational needs as defined by if they were in school. But as they got older and we carried on living together, it became apparent that there were some aspects of who they were that I knew from my experience of being in school that they would have been labelled in school as things like naughty, maybe, or disruptive, fidgety, and they would have been given a diagnosis under the umbrella of special educational needs. Specifically, one of my children has a formal diagnosis that we have that we pursued. So he is specifically he's autistic. He has a trait under autism of PDA, which some people will define as pathological demand avoidance.
Yeah.
Others will use it to define them as persistent drive for autonomy. And it means they really like to have ultimate control over what they're doing, which really sits well within unschooling, fortunately. And I am also convinced that another one of my children would have a similar diagnosis. He also has a diagnosis of ADHD and sensory processing disorder as well, and other sort of co-conditions with that, like hypermobility. So we've got there's a lot going on in our household, which we weren't aware of when we initially chose to.
It's a very lively household, but to you, and that's really important to work out, is that to you, it's no different, because that's all you've ever known, and to you, it's your family, and to you, there's no difference to that. Just going off the subject, I was talking to a lady a few weeks ago from another organisation that I'm going to be doing vlogs with, and she said her and her partner, they have 6 children between them, and all of them have some sort of SEND, whether it be autism or whatever. But she said it was a really interesting fact as well. It's something that really struck a chord with me as well, because of I'm physically disabled, cerebral palsy, but I use a wheelchair to get around. And apart from that, there's no difference between me and everyone else. But that lady was saying, when they're in the house all doing things together as a family, no one's different, everyone's the same. But it's society who disables you, and that's the case with me. When somebody's when I say, so I'm disabled and I'm looking for to make friends or something, or to meet people, because it is hard, because I've never really had a close friends or whatever, and people have just said, oh, join this disability group, join that disability group, and that isn't for me. I just want to be like everyone else. I suppose that can be the same with your children.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like when we're within the confines of our home, like our family, and not necessarily just in our house, but, as a family group, my children aren't made to feel ashamed of who they are.
Yeah.
And they're not made to, and that form of shame can take, feeling shame or being made to feel shame can take many, many different forms. But they're not made to feel ashamed of who they are. And one of the things that I recognized when I was working as a teacher, one of the things I saw year in and year out when I was working in schools, was that children in schools who don't fit within the box, and are not able, for whatever reason, are not able to access the curriculum that is being taught that year, and in the way that it is being taught, for whatever reason, if they can't access that and they need extra support, or they are diagnosed as having a special need, those people or those children there's an immediate division between those children and their peers. And
exactly,
it doesn't really matter how much you try and send out the message within for example, a school setting, send out a message that we're all the same, you know, there is no difference between us, you know, we're all, you know, we all have our own individuality. When you're working within a system that doesn't support that, you're giving those people mixed messages, you're giving those children mixed messages. And year in and year out, I saw children who were sort of taken out of lessons that they loved or activities that they loved, so sort of things like maybe more creative things like art or music, so that they could go and do more, so have support in the areas of the thing that they hated, you know, like they weren't any good, they weren't ready. I'm rephrasing that, they weren't ready to be independent readers or to be independent writers, but because they needed to be, because the education system requires that you are, they're then taken out of things that they truly love and are good at, so that they can go and do more of things that they actually really hate because they can't do what everyone else wants them to do. And that's miserable for anyone, but it's miserable particularly for children who can't or don't have a voice in which to say, I don't want to do this, I want to go back and do that art, I love art, you know. And there are children that live their lives predominantly in the, I'm going to use the word bottom, you know, in the bottom group, because that's how schools work. They, you know, put children in groups according to similar abilities, so that they can manage the delivery of education. And there are children that live predominantly in these bottom groups because they aren't fluent in reading or writing yet, or they're not able to like master the number system to the same degree as their peers. And that has a knock-on effect on their sense of self, on their sense of well-being, and that we know that follows them into adulthood. You know, there's research out there that shows how that, you know, constantly being in the bottom group, constantly being seen as less than, constantly having that support, actually affects, you know, their self-esteem and their well-being, you know, into adulthood, regardless of whether by the time they get to adulthood they can read and write, which for the most part they can. It's affecting their mental health as well. And the reality is that, you know, these children, as all of us, have strengths in other areas which are actually just as valid. And, you know, as I just mentioned, things like the reading, the writing, the math do come. It's just as within the school system, they have to come at the age, you know, they have to be taught to read and write when they're 4, 5, 6 years old, so that they can access the curriculum or have easier access to the curriculum as they age. And when you take those children out of school, you know, reading, writing and maths are still important. They are still things that, you know, we as human beings rely on in terms of communication and managing the world around us. But it doesn't have to happen at the age of 5 or 6. And, you know, there's research out there. One piece of research I know is by a guy called Peter Gray, who did some research on children who were in self-directing their own learning, and reported that, you know, children can learn to read and write independently on their own with the right support. So, you know, not just left to it, but with the right support when they are ready, anywhere between the age of about 4 and up until 14, which sounds crazy because you kind of go, well, how can a child live without reading until they're 14? You know, shouldn't I be intervening, and shouldn't we be making them learn to read? But the reality was that it didn't. By the time they got to 16, even if they only learned to read when they were 14, by the time they got to 16, their reading ability was the same as their peers. So it didn't affect sort of that level of understanding in terms of reading, just because they had learnt later. And of course, now we live in a world where there are other options as well. You know, you've got sort of text to voice and voice to text options,
Yeah.
and those sort of what we would call sort of special need aids, but they are all options, and we don't need to feel shame about using those things, if that's what we need. But predominantly, you know, quite common in schools comes this feeling of shame because of being you know, different, or because of having to use different aids.
Can I just add something that's really important? I think that's really important to me, for example, because we talked about, you know, well, we talked about the thing of like feeling ashamed because you've got a disability or whatever. It was the same with me because I've been bullied a lot in school, but we talk a lot about, you know, we want a really inclusive society for people, whether they have SEND, whether they have different religions, different skin colours, and all that starts within schools, you see, because when I was at school, you know, I talked about the transition I made from special school to mainstream school, which was good in a way, because I don't think I'd be the person that I am today if I didn't make that transition. But, you know, I was made to feel ashamed because of my disability at the school on a daily basis, because like I was bullied at various different times, and I was also at break time and lunch times, disabled people or children with SEND couldn't go out and play out with the peers at break and lunchtime, so we all had to sit in a room and like just do nothing, and that was really unfair because we weren't given that opportunity to grow and develop friendships. And that's how because I'm a really sociable person, and you know, I like to chat and meet different people. That's the thing that I've really missed out in my early adulthood, you know, like going away with friends on holidays and things, and they're the things that I've really missed out on, like not be able to go to a school in the same area where you live because the schools aren't fully equipped to meet the needs of people who are wheelchair users, and all that needs to change. And I had a friend who, in my first year, he was a few years younger than me, a few years older than me, so he was 15 when I was 11, and I got real friendly with him, but a lot of the time he was in trouble by a lot of teachers because he wasn't allowed to hang around with me because of that age gap. And I just thought it was really unfair, you know, you're given that opportunity, you're taking away that opportunity for me to make friends, and that's why I felt very lonely. That's why at lunchtimes I would eat my lunch in a toilet cubicle, because I never felt part of anything, and I still I still don't feel part of anything today. Like even when I've had like voluntary jobs anywhere, you know, I've never been fully included in like outings and stuff, and they're things that I really want to get involved in with the hope of doing these vlogs, really.
Yeah, it's really heartbreaking listening to stories like that, Steph. And the thing is, you're not alone in those stories. It's not like it's happened to one person. It happens day in and day out to multiple, you know, to people all the time. And it is really, you know, you use the word unfair. It's really unfair, and the unfairness of it, I think, is one of the things that contributes to the division of it, because what we end up with is you know, it's like, so in schools, it's really simple things like not being able to go to the toilet when you need to, and having like these rules about when you can go to the toilet. You know, some, apart from the fact that that's inhumane, that actually everybody should be able to have access to a facility when they need it. There are some people that need to have access to a facility when they need it. I know that wasn't very well put, but you know, they don't have the bodily ability in place to wait until lunchtime. You know, or being able to get up and move around. You know, some, you know, my son who has ADHD and other people who are very physically active, it's not just a case of them being fidgeting and ignoring what the is going on in the classroom. Their body needs that physical stimulation so that they can also process the information and the knowledge that they are being given. It's part of their processing ability, part of the way in which they learn. And they are being denied that because they're being told they have to sit still, and they have to face the front, and they have to have their legs crossed, and they have to have their hands in their lap, and they have to make eye contact, which is you know, a big red flag to a lot of people in the autistic community. The fact that it is insisted upon that they make eye contact with people, and these things. Part of the unfairness of it is that these children are being required to do something that goes against their natural instincts or their needs, their actual biological needs. So then what happens is they get this special dispensation. They get a diagnosis that says, this child needs support. Therefore, this child here is allowed to move around or allowed to fiddle with, you know, blue tack. That was quite common when I was in school. Or they have a special pass that they can use to go to the toilet. And then you've made an unfair system, because there are other children who maybe have not been able to access a diagnosis, but still have the same needs. Or quite frankly, children who are just children and want to fidget and move around, but they're being so good and dutiful that they're sat there doing the thing they're supposed to do, that it then becomes unfair in both fields, because, you know, you've then got a group of children who look at this other group and say, well, hang on, they're allowed to go to the toilet when they want to. Why can't I? And it makes the whole thing, incredibly problematic. And children who don't conform or fit inside that box become diagnosed. Often within the school system, they're labelled as somehow deficient, which they're not. And all of the interventions that are put in place are not primarily about actually helping the child. They are primarily about how best to make the child fit into the school system. Which is really, for me, where unschooling sort of comes in, because we are no longer worrying about how our child fits into the school system. And they are utterly free to, you know, go to the toilet when they want, spin around if they want to spin around. You know, I want to say climb the walls, but we wouldn't climb the walls, we'd go out and climb trees, and provide them with support that they actually need, that they actually need, not to fit into the school system, but to achieve the things that they want to achieve. So the support that we give them becomes defined by them and what they want to achieve.
I can relate to that really myself as well, Heidi, because when I was at school, you know, because of like disability, I had to have extra time in exams and a scribe, you know, because I can't write because of the spasticity in my fingers and hands. So I got a lot of my peers, my classmates saying to me, well, in exams, you have an unfair advantage because you have a support worker in there with you, and possibly they thought I was cheating, but I wasn't cheating. For me, it was double the work, because not only did I have to think about what the answer was, but I also had to tell the support worker what to write, you know, where to put my punctuation marks and stuff. So for me, I didn't have an unfair advantage. It was double the work for me, but you know, because of these certain systems within the schooling system, I was thought to have an unfair advantage over my peers when unfortunately that wasn't the case.
So remember, I'm going to tell this story, which has got nothing to do with unschooling. But when I just don't think people understand unless they've actually spent time and paid attention to what is going on with this person and what needs to happen in their world to make it, you know, we talk about people being disabled, you know, but quite often it's the environment that is disabling them, and there is a lot that can happen in an environment to re-enable them.
And it's as well, it's not just how society, the outside world disables people. It's about people's perceptions of disability as well, because this is my personal story. And this is one of the reasons why I hate social media. You know, I only use social media for my blog purposes. I put out a thing, you know, for like on Facebook, just to saying like, you know, I'm a young lady who's, you know, really outgoing. I have a physical disability, wheelchair user. And, you know, I just want to be social and meet people. And this one person came back and said, well, the Adult Learning Centre has classes for disabled people. I thought, fair enough, but I wasn't really looking at that. You see, I totally understand that people, you know, people who want to go to adult learning, that's fine, but for somebody like me, I wasn't really looking at that, and I weren't just looking at things for disabled people, because I don't see myself as disabled, even though I am. So, and then I wrote back just to say, air my opinion and freedom of speech, saying, you know, disabled people are entitled to a social life. You know, they don't have to be put in a classroom or anything, and, you know, just to be shut away. And this person wrote back to me and said, I think you're a very passive aggressive person, and you will not make friends because you're being very passive aggressive. I was only being nice, but you're being very passive aggressive. And I wasn't being passive aggressive, it was just I was airing my views. And that's the whole thing with society. People think because you've got a disability, you know, you're not entitled to your opinion. They just want to put you away in a day centre or an educational setting, you know, just to shut you up and give you something to do. Societies where disabled people are concerned, society has a certain life that society thinks you should live as a disabled person. But for me, I'm all about me wanting to live the life that I want to live, not the life that society expects me to live.
Yeah, and you know, like we have we have this thing where some of the misconceptions about home educating and unschooling in particular can be that, you know, we shut ourselves off from society, actually, that we are creating our own you know, that we're not actually engaging with society. And what I actually see is that when your child goes to school every day and they spend every day with the same 30 children in the same four walls with the same teacher in the same community, because schools are predominantly done on catchment areas, so, you know, within your demographic, you are taught about things like diversity, and you are taught about things like inclusion, but you don't actually overly live them, because you are with the same 30 people in the same four walls with the same adult, for the majority in the same community in your same catchment area. Whereas what we do is we go out and live our lives actually in the real world, like outside of those four walls. And one of the things that happens, our society at large has this habit of saying disabled people belong in a day centre, the elderly belong in a care home, our very young children belong in a nursery, and they actually segregate all of us. Oh yeah, and you know, working abled people belong at work. And they have it, you know, our society generally segregates us all from each other. Yet when I go down out of my catchment area, out of my village, and take my children down to the beach for the morning, and we play on the beach in term time, we are surrounded by elderly folk. We met a really chatty guy this past couple of weeks. My daughter fell off her scooter. We were sat on a bench tending her, you know, knee, her grazed knee, and we met a really lovely older guy who came and sat next to us, who had a small child with him, and I made the assumption that the small child was his grandchild, and he explained that he was actually a foster carer. But he also sat there and chatted with us about his life on the trawlers and the fishing that he used to do on the trawlers, and the things that they used to trawl up out of the sea. This great conversation with this older guy. You know, we also bump into people, or we come across people who have mobility issues, you know, very young children running around. We do manage to spot other home educators down there, because they're the ones with the school age children. You know, people who choose to dress, well, however they choose to dress, but they're not in a school uniform. They're not all uniform the same. And so when I look at our lives, I see that actually my children have access to a lot of diversity, in terms of, well, I mean, almost everything. I don't like to talk in absolutes, but you know, compared to their schooled peers. And you mentioned earlier about your friend who was several years older than you, and that you weren't actually allowed to socialize within schools. I think that's to the detriment. I think not having you know, cross-generational relationships is to the detriment of our society and to our children.
You're learning all the time. You know, you can learn up till you're about 100. You know, learning doesn't stop at like 16 and 17 or whatever. So your children would have been learning all at the same time. And but this goes back to a conversation I had with Rachel Evans, who's another home educator, and she was saying through her homeschooling, her young child who's 8, one of her children who's 8, he has a friendship with a 13-year-old. Now, for them, that's completely normal, but for in a schooling environment, that would be frowned upon.
Be seen as incredibly unusual and a little bit odd. But you're right. We, you know, my children have friends who are all ages. My children feel very confident and able to talk to adults, and not just I don't know, not just answer questions about school, which they can't do, but actually have meaningful conversations with adults, you know, expressing their opinions, giving their ideas, you know, making, you know, suggesting where the adult might want to go and look up, you know, this vlog that they saw, or this person on social media that is, you know, could help them out with their the topic they're discussing, you know, or a book they've read. Yeah, it's really, you know, meaningful conversations, and they feel very, or some of them feel very confident doing that. You know, that is obviously personality comes into that as well. So it's not always guaranteed that that's going to be how a young person will be. But I think that the way home educated children relate to cross-generational, you know, people outside of their peer group is very, very different, and different in a good way, I think. So we've gone off the subject a little bit, haven't we there, Steph?
But it's nice to just have a little chat about the genuine, because all this is about life experience as well. You know, people are just so much interested in like text, but you know, you've got to learn everything from text, but you've got to do things a certain way. But I think, you know, life isn't just about sitting in a classroom and learning from a book. You've got to go out and experience life, and that's how I want to do. But people don't fully understand that. They just see my disability and think, yeah, she belongs in an adult learning class, or she belongs in a day centre. When really, I'm not that person at all. So I'm not into disability groups. You know, I just want to go out and have fun. You know, have a cocktail with someone, have a good chat with them, go dancing and things. They're the sort of things I want to do.
Yeah, I think actually this does tie in nicely, actually, Steph, because one of the things that we do when we unschool our children is we trust our children. I'm not using a curriculum and saying you need to learn this curriculum. You need to, you know, which basically says at this age you need to learn this. And if you don't learn that, or you're not interested in learning that, or you're unable to learn that, then there's something wrong with you. But what the child is doing, our children are constantly telling us what they want. And even within the context of children with special educational needs, our children are telling us what they want. And they might not be explicit about it. They might not get up in the morning and say, today I'm going to learn about, you know, World War One. Although with age, that might be something that comes. But particularly when our children are younger, it can be them in their choices. What are they choosing to play with? What are they drawn towards? What do they want to do? What do they want to do? And it's also the opposite of that. It's also when they say no. You know, it's when we say, you know, let's do this today, and they say no. And of course, no can be verbal, but it can also be in their actions as well. You know, some children don't need to actually say the word no; they just run away, and go, you know, yeah. And that's what they do.
The whole out of body language.
Yeah, and if you and as a parent, you know when your child's upset or when they're resisting something. But I think this links into what you're saying, Steph, because you know what you want. You know, and you're clearly saying this is what I want, and other people are then saying, actually, no, what that's not what you want. What you really want is to go is to go to a day centre.
Yeah.
And I think generally, on the whole, as a society, we don't. We certainly don't trust children. We don't trust children to tell us what they want to learn and how they want to learn it and what they want to do. But that then infiltrates into other areas as well. You know, we don't trust people of colour to tell us what they want or what they need. We don't trust people with disabilities to tell us what they want or what they need. You know, society says, well, oh no, actually what you need is a special place to go with special people. And we don't listen to people when they say this is what I want to do or this isn't what I want to do. but that's it. So it does tie in really nicely, because that is what I wanted to say, I think, today about our children with maybe what we would call define as special needs, but what our how do we know what our children need if we're not using a curriculum, or we're not trying to make them fit into a box, and we're not trying to make them sit still when clearly they don't want to sit still. What are we doing, and how do we know what they need? And how we know is by listening to our children and trusting them. If they want to spend a morning spinning around in circles, that's because that's what they need to do, and we need to trust that. And we need to, and it won't last forever, because some people get sort of hooked up on this idea that they're going to be doing this forever. Like they're going to be stuck in this place. They won't be doing that forever. It will change, and it will develop, and it will grow into, and mature. They will. But if our children if our children want to be moving around and climbing all over the furniture and being really active, then we need to enable them to be able to do that, not be trying to get them to sit still because we think children should be sitting still. We need to provide an environment where they can run around. So I mentioned earlier, climbing the walls scenario, we would do things like I'd take my children to soft play areas, we'd go to the woods and climb trees, we'd move furniture around in our rooms so that they could play like the floor is lava, or we'd make obstacle courses. It's really about recognizing what our children are doing and then facilitating, enabling them to do that and to do more of it. So it is really about trusting trusting our children.
There's got to be a cross inclusion society where we can help and learn from each other, no matter who or what we are.
And really listening to each other and really understanding what those people need and what those people want, which is one of the things that happens in a large family. There's lots of discussion about what people need and what people want.
Like with these, sorry, because I'm really passionate about this and like really highlighting it. Just like, when people, they have like social things going on for disabled people, which is great, if that disabled person wants to join that, but that's the other reason why it's not for me, because these groups and stuff, they have like curfews to say like 6 to 8, we'll go to the cinema, but we've got to like see like a 6 p.m. showing and then be back at like 8 o'clock, and life isn't like that, As a 28-year-old woman, I don't want to be in at like 8 o'clock on a Saturday night. I want to be out until like, till midnight or whatever, until I feel tired, till when my body tells me, it's time to go home, not when someone in society or someone in authority tells me, oh, it's time to go home and you've got to go to bed now.
Yeah, you want some control. You don't want somebody else controlling or telling you how you feel or what you want to do or when you want to do it. I love the example about sleep, because that's quite a common one, particularly with children. Adults telling children when they're tired and they should go to bed. And that's not to say that children don't need help recognizing those symbols and signals, those tired signals, and maybe need help and support to help them rest. But when somebody else overrides them entirely and says, no, you're going to bed at this time no matter what, they lose all control over their own lives, and they miss an opportunity to learn about those cues of being tired.
Like, for example, when in my life, people have always said to me, like, I remember when somebody in authority said to me, like, oh, what time do you go to bed, and like, what's your favourite drink? And like, when I say, like, I just go to bed when I feel tired, of my favourite drink on a Saturday night. Oh, well, they say I've got to have an orange juice before I go to bed on a Saturday night. But if I say, like, oh, I might like a glass of wine, or, you know, an alcohol pop or something, then they're really surprised. You know, I have tattoos, and as a disabled person, people are really shocked when I say that I have tattoos, saying, oh, it allows you to have a tattoo when a disabled person can't be having sex or have a tattoo. And so they're the sort of boundaries that I want to break down into, like, disabled people are just like normal citizens of society, and they should be treated like a human being and as an individual, and be able to explore the likes, dislikes, you know, their own sexualities and what they're into.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that hopefully I'm giving my children, and people who unschool give their children. They give them a voice, they give them individuality. So it's not about saying, you know, my child is autistic PDA and therefore he's the same as every other child who is autistic PDA, and to lump them together. But it's about saying, you know, that he's an individual, and enabling him to find his voice and practice using it within the context of our home. Again, moving away from being shamed, being shut down, you know, being told he's wrong, you know, about himself, which is common, and, you know, enabling our children to know themselves really well, to have experience of being within a family, and hopefully within an extended community of people who treat them as individuals, who listen to what they're saying, and you know, respect them and trust them as people. Yeah, so I'm fiddling with a little fiddle toy because I bought them to show, and I think I need to show some before we wrap up.
Just to finish off, and then we'll talk about toys and stuff.
So one of the things that we do as unschoolers is I quite frequently say, do more of the things they love. So if they love spinning, let them spin. If they love bouncing, get a trampoline or go to a trampoline park. You know, if they want to climb the walls, do all those things that I talked about before. If they you see, this is something that my children used to do. One of my children in particular used to love really enclosed spaces. So we actually, I say we didn't, he did. He used to empty the cupboard under the stairs, and then he used to like drag a beanbag or a blanket in there and a torch, and he'd shut the door, and he'd make this little space. You know, so then we went on to like make spaces under the bed for him, or like make little, you know, quite often we would come downstairs and he'd be on the sofa, but he'd have like an entire blanket like over his head, and he'd be like reading a book or playing on his tablet or something under the blanket. You know, and instead of saying things like, you know, get out from under there, and, you know, I need to see your face, or you're being antisocial, allowing them to do that, because that's, you know, he wanted that feeling of being enclosed.
His way of expressing himself.
Yeah, and that's what he needed at that point. But one of the things my daughter needs right now is sensory toys, or they call them fiddle toys, really. And we have invested in lots, and I've bought some to show you. So these are quite common now. Have you seen these, Steph?
No, I've not. I've not really seen many sensory toys, so this is a new learning experience for me as well.
Okay, well, this is like permanent bubble wrap. So you can see these little circles here. So they're like the bubbles on the bubble wrap, and then you just push them like you would on bubble wrap, and they pop, which you may or not be able to hear. But because it's reusable, you turn it over and then you can pop them the other way.
Right.
So they love doing that. They make up little games with them, but they're fiddle friendly. You know, you could just sit and pop pop the little buttons, and they come in all different shapes. I mean, this one's I'm now counting the sides to find out what it is. 1, 2, 3. This is an octagon. This is an octagon, but you can get them in, like, you can get seahorses and butterflies, and they come in all different shapes and colors. This one's actually my favorite. It's so tiny. Look at me showing you something really tiny. It's got little buttons here, so it's supposed to look like a game controller, but it's got little buttons here that you can press, and then it's got like a little stick here that you can move around, but it's also got buttons on the top that roll, so these ones roll, and then it's got another one on the top, which is now the top now, but that's a button that presses up and down, and then this one sort of, see if I can, like a light switch, that one goes on and off, and then this one, don't know what this one does. Oh, this one goes round and round, so you can just sit and hold it like a little game controller and fiddle with the different components on that. There's another one in here which is very similar, actually. It's called a fidget cube, so it's got sort of the same sort of stuff but different buttons and sliders and things, but it's actually on
a bit like a Rubik's cube, but I suppose, but for young children, really.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I was going to talk about the Rubik's cube in a minute, so hold that thought. There's this little gizmo. I don't even know what half of these are called. We got these in a multi-pack, I think. But this sort of these are all just fidget toys, really. Well, a cross between fidget toys and sensory toys. So there's sort of two types of sensory extremes, maybe, to sensory experiences. And one is sensory, I'm going to have to remember what they're called now. Sensory, it's to do with sensory input, and one of them is to do with you needing more sensory input, and one of them is to do with you needing less sensory input, and these ones are all to do with you needing more sensory input, and this one, I'm trying to hold it so you can see it. It's got a marble in it, and you just push it along this weaved case. So yeah, and some people would look at these things and think, well, what's the point of that? But they're for our children or for adults or anyone who needs it.
Anti-stressors, really.
Yeah, they help send signals to the brain that are relaxing and calming, and they help with self-regulation in the brain, and therefore help you to manage doing other things at the same time. Sometimes you can use them separately. So if you need to maybe process something or decompress from an experience that you've had, these help you to regulate from that. But you can also use them whilst you're, like if you were listening to a lecture, maybe, it can actually just help your brain to calm, and so that you can actually take that information from a lecture in. Not that my 9-year-old's listening to lectures, but the point is that these things aren't specifically for children. This one is peas in a pod. This has got, they've got like marbles inside these as well, but they don't actually move up and down or along the peas in a pod, but it's just lumpy, hard lumps inside there. And then this one I hold cautiously, because when we talk about different sensory needs, my daughter, this is very, very soft and very, very squishy, and I can't bear it. I'll give it a go. So it's just really soft and squishy, and I can't bear it. She hides them in my bag. I was telling Steph this earlier. She hides them in, well, she doesn't hide them in my bag. She puts them in my bag when we go out, and then I put my hand in them, and it's not pleasant. I don't find it pleasant. Yeah, I've got lots of things in here, but you can buy these things like just off. I'm going to use the word Amazon, I'm afraid, but you can just buy them off of Amazon. They come in like multi packs, and they're called sensory toys. These ones are fidget toys. So we've got other things in our house as well. So we've got things for those who are having sensory overwhelm, so where things are too much, where things are too noisy, too bright, too busy, and they need to reduce that sensory experience. So we've got things like ear defenders, we've got things like ear plugs, we've got weighted blankets, or they can be called pressure blankets, and you put them on, and just feeling the sense of pressure on your body reduces your sensory input to other things. My husband stole the sensory blanket, the weighted blanket. I bought one because I thought that one of my children in particular can find certain environments very overstimulating, and that can often result in what people might call a meltdown, because it's too overwhelming for her, and her body can't cope, so she has a meltdown. And so I bought this weighted blanket to help with that process, to ground her, to feel the weight on her body so she can physically feel, her own body. My husband stole that. So which is why when I talk about these things, I don't talk about them being specifically for children, because the Rubik's Cube, let's go back to the Rubik's Cube. My 14-year-old loves Rubik's Cubes. He's recently spent a fair amount of time watching tutorials about how to solve Rubik's Cubes, and he now does that, but he will do that constantly. He'll do it when he's watching films, he'll do it when he's online with his friends, but it's essentially a fiddle toy. That's essentially what it is. It's a grown-up fiddle toy, but it is a fiddle toy. He also has butterfly knives, which sound dangerous, but they're not. And you do tricks with them. But again, it's a fiddle toy. You sit and you flick this knife this way and that way, and then you do a double flick this way and you spin it that way. It's essentially a fiddle toy, but it just isn't marketed as one. And my husband also has a ball, if you can imagine a ball, but like with a flat bottom, so it sits on the table, and it's got a spiral carved down the ball, and it spins, and that I would class it's what we would call very stimmy. It's very visually pleasing when it spins. Again, it's marketed as a sort of a work desk. I don't even know what it's marketed as, but it's a stimming piece. It's a stimming toy, and so there are lots of things out there that might be classed as, I'm going to use the word normal, but actually to all intents and purposes are sensory toys and fidget toys and the like, but they're disguised as adult
items.
Things. Items, that's a good word. Adult items, which again is why I didn't want to narrow it down to saying this is all about children. But what will happen with our children is they will tell us what they need, and that's what's really important in terms of unschooling, that we listen to our children and we don't stop them from needing those things, or making them do something that they feel extremely uncomfortable doing. So the eye contact thing, it's really quite important, because actually for some people, putting their energy into making that eye contact means that they then actually can't concentrate on the other thing that's going on. So saying you need to look at me while I tell you this piece of information, because this piece of information is very important. Well, that might be true, but they're now putting so much energy into concentrating on eye contact, and it can for some people even be physically painful to do that, and they're putting so much energy into doing that they're not listening to what you're telling them anyway, because they can't do both. And this was one of the lessons I learned with my now 12-year-old, particularly when he was younger and he was constantly moving, was that people would say, oh, he's not listening, or he's not taking in the information. And we used to do things like science clubs. I can remember a science club which we did in someone's garden, with in a home educating group, and the guy that was running it was just brilliant. He was really engaging. He didn't mind the kids like bombarding him with questions. It wasn't how you would imagine a science club would go in school. Like the children weren't all sat there cross-legged, sitting there quietly, like listening to him. It was a completely different scenario. The children were like completely asking him like all the questions all the time, and he was brilliant, and he was on it, and he would answer them. And so I had one child who would be in the throng of that group and with the other children doing that. And then I would have my now 12-year-old, who was a lot younger at the time, maybe about 7, in another part of the garden, doing cartwheels and I don't know what he was doing. He was just not part of the group. And to all intents and purposes, you would look at him and say, he wasn't paying attention, he wasn't listening, he wasn't interested. He wasn't learning any of the science. He was doing his own thing, and that was fine. But it turns out that he was listening, and he'd come home, or a few days later, he'd say to someone, like he'd say to grandma, or he'd say to, his dad, or he'd say to his brother who was there, oh, that scientist guy did that. I can't even think of an example now, but he would then recall like what was going on.
It was listening, but doing cartwheels on the garden was his way of listening.
Yeah, and it was fascinating because, it was completely not what I had been told as a teacher. It was completely not what I had been told that was going on. If he wasn't there and he wasn't watching the person and he wasn't, looking like he was listening, then he's not paying attention. And it just wasn't true. And the more that I continued to allow my children to do the things that they needed, the more I realized that it was fine. It was fine. They were learning what they needed to, and they were doing what they needed to help them manage a situation, manage an environment, or listen. He was listening in whilst he was doing cartwheels. And if I had forced him to sit there and listen, he would have been putting so much energy into the I can't move, that he would have missed what was actually, what the science element of what was going on. Plus he would have, felt the shame of not being able to do what he needed to do, not be able to be who he was. So, we just have to realize that it might not happen it might not happen in the same way as school. It might not happen in the same time frame as school. But it will happen in their own time, and it will happen when they are developmentally ready. It will happen. I'm all for adult support. So, being there to support our children. And we recognize that whatever they're doing, they are learning what they need to learn at that time. And that learning does happen all the time. When they have their own need or their own desire to learn it, then then they will. And our children sort of hopefully free from shame and that stigma of not fitting in, and they flourish in their own time, and sort of regardless of what their achievements might be, they have a confidence in their self. So going back to me talking earlier about children who are affected by shame and self-confidence and self-esteem later in life, that actually our children will have this confidence in their selves, and that their worth, which we talked about in our first vlog, if you remember, their worth is not dependent on their productivity. It's not dependent on when they learnt to read or what their SAT score was or their GCSE mark. Their worth is just in who they are.
So I think that'd be a good place to finish off with. Obviously, thank you for joining me today, and thanks everyone for listening. What is it next time? Did we say we're going to talk about literature and stuff?
Yeah, I think we were going to do something about literature, which I think we have yet to iron out what aspect we're going to cover.
Talking about children's literature, you may be revisiting some children's books and then talking about adult literature and stuff. I think that'd be quite interesting.
Yeah, be a real mix, I think, that one. Yeah.